All right, grade five. So moving on to homesteads and villages. We know now that the farmers from Central Africa had moved down into Southern Africa, and because they were farmers, they wanted to settle in one place. So therefore, they wanted to use the land to grow crops and herd their cattle and produce their cattle. So unlike the San that moved around to find food, the farmers wanted to settle down into one place. So with this came homesteads and villages. So it's important that you know the difference between what a homestead and a village is. So a homestead would be owned by an elder, and he may have had more than one wife, and each wife would have a hut to sleep in, and he would have had children as well that would live there with him in his homestead. These homesteads were made out of clay houses or mud houses with straw roofs because, as we said, they are settling there. They're not going to be moving around. And many of these homesteads put together would make up then a village. Now, what's important to remember is each village would be of the same clan. So what I mean by the same clan is they'd be linked to a common ancestor. And this is found through lineage. So we can say for our specific lineage, we have a unique surname and we can trace back to where we come from. So it was the same thing with the homesteads and the villages. A village would either be a Zulu village, a Xhosa village, a Venda village, etc. So it was all to a common ancestor. In homesteads and villages, there were specific roles of people and there were specific people that would do specific things. And we're going to talk about that now. And also what the farmers from Central Africa, what knowledge they brought with them down into South Africa. So the next slide we'll look at, chief. As I said, with the homestead, it's an elder that is in charge of the homestead. But all the homesteads together make up the village, and the person who's in charge of the village is the chief. Now, the chief is elected by the elders of each homestead, so they'll all come together and have a meeting, and in that meeting they will elect the chief. Now, the chief's job is to make sure that the land is distributed evenly and fairly, and that all the resources are used wisely and not all used up. So just like with the San and the Khoi, they would make sure not to use everything so they could sustain themselves and make sure that there was enough for the future. This was a similar thing with the chief, and he had to make sure that this happened. Now, inside these homesteads and villages, there were a few different roles from different people. All right, mainly the men would be in charge of the cattle and herding and hunting, and the woman would be in charge of keeping the homestead maintained, the cooking, etc. Now, young men and young women, as well as boys and girls, they would help their elders in order to learn. So the girls would stay with their moms, and the boys would go with their dads and the elders in order to learn how to either hunt or herd cattle, and the girls would learn how to cook and grow crops, etc. So the next slide, we look at the role of cattle. So the men would have been in charge of the cattle, and their job was to cultivate, not to cultivate, but to herd and look after the cattle. So cattle had a few roles, mainly for their food, milk, and skins, but they could also be used for wedding ceremonies, for taxes, as gifts, as well as for traditional ceremonies. So the cattle had a few significant roles that they played, and it was very important to the village and homestead. And then the more cattle that a village would have, the more wealthy the village was seen. Alright, so the next slide being the iron and copper age. This is what the African farmers, the knowledge that they brought with them into Southern Africa. They knew how to extract iron from iron ore. So if you look at this rock over here, this is referred to as iron ore. And what they would do is they would build a clay furnace, and then by using animal skins make a bellow to pump air into this furnace, and by pumping the air into the furnace it would make it extremely hot. So they were able to melt the iron ore out of the rock, so extract it, and then build tools such as spearheads, hammers, cutting tools, etc. So the iron and copper age was very important to them, and they obviously now could work a lot easier and hunt a lot better. Unlike the San and the Khoi that we're still using the Stone Age type tools in order to hunt with. Alright, so the next slide being pottery. The women of the village would have been responsible for making clay pottery. They'd found a technique by heating up the pottery. It would make it extremely hard, and therefore they could use it for cooking. And this was also very important. They could store water, and they didn't have to walk every day to get water, as they were able to store it around the homestead or the village. So a very useful tool that they were able to use along with the copper and iron age technology that the Central African farmers had brought along. Alright, so as we move on to medicine and healing, each village would have had a traditional healer. These are referred to as Sangomas. And what they would do is they would make use of natural plants, roots and barks as a form of medicine. Alright, grade 5s, and then the last slide being hunting. So this was the other role that people played inside the village. The hunting was carried out by the men. Sometimes a woman would go along with the men in order to carry supplies or make the food. But the men themselves would do the hunting. It wasn't always done together, but if they did do it together, it was used as a form of learning to teach the younger men how to hunt. But they would separate into two groups, and one group would chase the animal towards the hunters, and then the second group would hunt the animal. Now, their hunting technique was very different from the San, because the San used to use poison arrows. Because of the iron and the copper age and the technology they could use to make certain weapons, they were able to hunt an animal without using poison.